Imagine a vast land, rich in gold, iron, and coal, that for centuries was dismissed as nothing more than a barren wilderness. Yet today, this very land fuels global industries, anchors Western alliances, and holds a frontline position in the world's most tense geopolitical rivalries. This is the story of Australia, not just a continent, but a game-changing power in the making. Covering nearly 3 million square miles, Australia is both the smallest continent and the sixth largest country in the world. But what really sets it apart is how different life here feels compared to the rest of the world. While people in Europe and North America are shoveling snow in December, Australians are firing up barbecues and celebrating Christmas on the beach under the summer sun. Then there is the wildlife, with kangaroos hopping across highways, wombats digging up gardens, and koalas lounging in backyards. Animals are part of daily life in a way that feels almost surreal. Australia is also the only continent that is a single country, isolated for millions of years, which gave rise to a completely unique ecosystem. More than 80% of its plants and animals exist nowhere else on Earth, including the platypus and the Tasmanian devil. But here's the twist. Once upon a time, Australia wasn't famous for sports at all. It was a land of criminals and convicts. Even more surprising, around 20% of today's Australian population are descendants of those very convicts transported here in the 18th and 19th centuries. In other words, 1 out of every 5 Australians today may trace their family tree back to someone who was once a convicted criminal. Imagine that. The great-grandchildren of convicts could now be your modern-day Australian ministers, scientists, athletes, or teachers. This past has even sparked controversy in sports. Back in the 1990s, Sri Lankan national cricket team captain Arjuna Ranatunga made headlines when, responding to personal attacks from Shane Warne, he remarked, "Our culture is 2,500 years old, but we all know where Australians come from." So let's roll back in time, to the era when the first prisoners set foot on this land, and Australia transformed from a penal colony into a nation. By the late 18th century, Britain was facing a serious problem. Crime was on the rise, and prisons were overflowing. Before American independence in 1776, Britain used to send its convicts to the American colonies. But after the US broke away, that option vanished. Britain needed a new land to send its criminals. Their eyes fell on the distant and mysterious continent, then known as Terra Australis, the Southern Land. Although Dutch sailors had reached parts of Australia as early as 1606, and Captain James Cook had mapped sections of the coastline in the 1770s, the continent was still largely unexplored by Europeans. On January 26, 1788, Britain's first fleet arrived at Botany Bay, with more than 700 convicts, soldiers, and officers. Finding the land unsuitable for farming, they soon moved to Port Jackson, today part of modern Sydney. There, they established the colony of New South Wales, the first European settlement in Australia. In the beginning, it was essentially an open-air prison, with no walls or fences. Convicts were forced into hard labor under harsh conditions, struggling with unfamiliar land, tough climate, and food shortages. But as time passed and sentences ended, many former convicts chose to stay instead of returning home. They took up farming and trades, slowly becoming part of the colonial economy. Over time, free settlers also began arriving farmers, traders, and government officials. New colonies emerged across the continent: Tasmania, Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, and Queensland. But this growth came at a devastating cost for Australia's Indigenous peoples. When the British arrived, the land was home to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, one of the world's oldest continuous cultures going back at least 60,000 years. They lived in hundreds of tribes with unique languages, traditions, and deep spiritual ties to the land. As colonization spread, Indigenous people were systematically dispossessed of their land, massacred, and in many cases, entire tribes were wiped out. The infamous Stolen Generations policy saw thousands of Aboriginal children forcibly taken from their families and placed with white families or church missions in an attempt to civilize them, a cruel practice that continued into the mid-20th century. Then came a turning point: the gold rush of the early 1850s. When gold was discovered in Victoria and New South Wales, people from across Europe and beyond flocked to Australia. The economy boomed, cities grew, railroads were built, and infrastructure expanded rapidly. Between 1851 and 1871, Australia's population quadrupled from 430,000 to 1.7 million. Australia was no longer just a land of convicts. It was becoming a diverse society with its own emerging identity. By the late 19th century, the Australian colonies of New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, and Tasmania were beginning to push for greater self-rule and unity. They understood that by joining together, they could more effectively manage defense, trade, and immigration. After years of debates, referendums, and negotiations, their vision became reality on January 1, 1901, when these 6 colonies united to form the Commonwealth of Australia. For the first time, the new nation had its own parliament, prime minister, and constitution, while still remaining under the British Crown. During World War I, Australian soldiers fought under the Anzac, Australia, and New Zealand Army Corps' banner at battles like Gallipoli. By World War II, Australia had shifted alliances, choosing the United States over Britain, especially as Japan expanded its influence across the Pacific. Legal independence came gradually. The Statute of Westminster in 1942, and finally, the Australia Act of 1986, which severed most remaining legal ties with Britain. Today, Australia is fully sovereign, though it still recognizes the British monarch as its symbolic head of state. Modern Australia has a population of about 26.6 million, with nearly 3.8%, around 1 million people, being Indigenous. Though smaller in number, Indigenous communities remain strong and vibrant, keeping their languages, traditions, and art alive. Even in sports, their presence is felt. International players like Scott Boland, Darcy Short, Jason Gillespie, and Daniel Christian have all proudly represented Australia in cricket. But history remains complicated. Every year on January 26th, Australians celebrate Australia Day, marking the arrival of the First Fleet in 1788. Yet for Indigenous communities, this is Invasion Day, a reminder of dispossession, violence, and loss. Many commemorate it as a day of mourning, and protests are common. A similar cultural clash surrounds Uluru, formerly known as Ayers Rock. This giant sandstone monolith is sacred to the Aboriginal people. For decades, tourists climbed it, but in 2019, climbing was officially banned out of respect for Indigenous traditions, since they consider climbing the rock deeply offensive. Interestingly, in the early years of independence, having convict ancestors was considered shameful in Australia. Many families hid that part of their history to maintain social status. But over time, Australians began embracing it as part of their identity. Today, being a convict descendant is worn proudly, a badge of honor. Schools and universities teach their stories, and public institutions celebrate them as the nation's true founders. In fact, former Prime Ministers Scott Morrison and Kevin Rudd both trace their ancestry back to convicts. Fast forward to the present, Australia is one of the world's most successful democracies. Cities like Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Perth are regularly ranked among the best in the world. By 2024, its GDP had reached $1.75 trillion, making it the 13th largest economy globally. Australia is strong in education, research, sports, and environmental efforts, and plays an active role in global alliances like the Quad and AUKUS, working closely with the US to counter China's growing influence in the Indo-Pacific. Yet, despite its modern achievements, much of Australia remains empty. Nearly 95% of its land is uninhabited, with most people living in coastal cities. That's because much of the interior is arid, with harsh climates and little rainfall, making it difficult to live there. And let's not forget its unique wildlife. About 87% of mammals, 93% of reptiles, 94% of frogs, and 45% of birds found in Australia exist nowhere else on Earth. From kangaroos and koalas to platypuses and emus, Australia remains one of the most ecologically distinct places in the world. So, from being a penal colony of the British Empire to becoming a resource powerhouse, A military ally of the West and a key player in the Indo-Pacific, Australia's journey is nothing short of remarkable. Its future will be shaped by how it balances economic ties with China and security commitments with the US and its allies. And that's what makes Australia a country the world simply cannot ignore. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share. Your support helps us bring you more stories that uncover the hidden forces shaping our world.